that is reminiscent of an enclosure wall of a city or a monastery, but we don't know. And the horizon is very, very low. In the foreground, there is a river. And take my word, if you cannot see it, and after we finish, you can come to the front and look at the details. There are all sorts of fish and waterfowl frolicking in the river, enjoying themselves in the seemingly the most inappropriate way. But why would they be there? Because it's spring. It's the time when nature renews itself. It's the beginning of life for the new season. And this is, of course, one of the symbolic significances of the feast of the Annunciation. It coincides with the renewal of nature. Now, what is the significance of the elevated garden? It's called the enclosed garden. The Victorian tradition of secret and enclosed gardens goes all the way back, but in the Victorian era, it's secularized. Back in time, in the medieval period, the enclosed garden was always considered a symbol of preserved virtue, of saved, preserved virtue. Well, now we know that this is a symbol of the Holy Virgin because she is the one who preserved her virtue before she was pregnant with Christ, when she was pregnant with Christ, and after she gave birth to Christ. So this elevated garden is a symbol of the Virgin and of her virtue. Right below the elevated garden is the doorway with the curtain half lifted. We are invited to go in. We are invited to cross this threshold, and we can do this because of the miracle of the Incarnation. This threshold and this gateway leads into eternal life. And it's possible because of the miraculous event that takes place in this composition. Here is, so you don't think that I'll make everything up, just a little bit, but this is the dove of the Holy Spirit. It's descending from heaven, and his descent marks the miracle of the Incarnation. And there is an inscription in Greek which are the words of Archangel Gabriel, who descends from heaven, and he tells, "Rejoice, you are the chosen among all women on earth." And that is the Greek quotation that has to do with what his gesture of blessing, his talking hand, is conveying. Now, let's turn our attention to him. He's the fanciest angel of them all. I have to tell you that I have found only one that can compete to fanciness, in fanciness to this one. Look at him. First of all, he's dressed in what undoubtedly appears to be silk. This is very light silk, and it's floating in the air. And the folds of the silk are so elegant. And if you examine carefully the twist of his body, you will be stunned that he hasn't fallen apart. But then again, he's an angel. So you can see from the back his shoulders. You see his head in 3/4. You see in perfect profile the middle of the torso. You see the middle of his body in full profile, and then his legs are positioned in a way that would not make for a comfortable pose by any standard. There is one more example of this kind of rendition of the figure of Archangel Gabriel, located in the frescoes of a church commissioned by a member of the imperial family of Constantinople in the early 12th century. And so scholars have tried to explain what is the reason for this very unusual rendition of the angel. And a scholar who recently retired from the faculty of Johns Hopkins, who studied at Harvard. He did his PhD there. His name is Henry Maguire, an American Byzantinist, discovered a series of 12th century, late 11th and 12th century Byzantine literary compositions that he thinks, and I completely agree with him, and I admire his discovery very much, he thinks that these literary compositions explain the depiction of Archangel Gabriel, because they all deal with the bewilderment of Archangel Gabriel, because it's an old tradition in Christian homilies. As early as the late 4th century in Constantinople, the author of the oldest Christian liturgy, St. John Chrysostom, wrote a composition on the Feast of the Annunciation and elaborated on the subject of how bewildered and puzzled and somewhat confused was Archangel Gabriel when God sent him on this mission. Because the Archangel has done everything that God has ever asked him to do, but he could not believe that what he was about to announce was possible. So he has to do it reluctantly or with hesitance, and this hesitation and this uncertainty, this fear that he's doing something that is not right, is manifested visually in the unusual twist of Archangel Gabriel's body. Similarly, in the same set of texts, we find references to the very obvious eternal theme that the rejuvenation and the rebirth of nature after the end of winter is one of the manifestations of the joy of the Christian universe at the miracle of the Incarnation. So that's what we have in this icon. So we have to acknowledge the fact that in addition to the canonical texts of the Old and the New Testament, Christian art over centuries incorporated details coming from multiple other literary compositions, and it formed a tradition of its own, which enriched the content of the images, but it also provided for more complex and more fulfilling experiences on the side of the audiences who could fully appreciate the richness of this art. To continue, of course, she is of course spinning wool. This is the spindle. This is the cluster of purple wool, and the cord of this purple wool always appears in front of her womb, because this is the site of mankind's salvation, and it is the body of the Virgin that is the miracle of the Incarnation, that is the instrument of the miracle of the Incarnation. And so here is the purple, the red cord right here. If you cannot see it, take my word for it, and then we can approach it and examine it carefully. And so these are icons, and icons were used for personal devotion. You could keep an icon like this in your room, and you can pray to this icon at any time. And I always try to explain what is the significance of the invention of icons as devotional objects to my students, and I've discovered the perfect way to show it to undergraduates in the United States in 2015 by using iPhones as a parable. I said, well, when I was young, when I was an undergraduate student, I studied away from home, and in order to make in the city of Moscow, which is a different country, and it was communism and it was scary, to call my parents, I had to go to the center of the city of Moscow, to the main post office, and place a call from there. That is what was the case with pagan devotion before Christianity came about. Why so? If you want to pray to Zeus, you go to Olympus. It doesn't matter where you are. You travel to Olympus. You want to worship Apollo. You have to go to Delphi. You may live in Egypt. You take the ship, you travel. That's where you go. There's one place. There are maybe two places in the Mediterranean. Oh, you have to worship Dionysus. You go somewhere on the territory of my native country. Nobody knows where exactly, but there was a sanctuary of Dionysus. And then Christianity came about, and it invented these devotional pieces that are portraits of saints, the Virgin, and Christ. And you can carry them with you, and you can have them in your bedroom. And it's like having an iPhone or a cell phone, and you can always be in touch. You can always feel that there is a possibility of transcendence. that you do not exist on your own. You're not a lost soul. You can always turn to God or to your patron saint. And that's what icons provided. And on special days, like the one today, when we are gathered, these icons would be decorated with flowers. They would have wreaths of flowers, and candles would be burning in front of them, and incense would be given as an offering to them. So they would come alive. And you're supposed to go to the icon and touch it and kiss it and talk to it. It's not like a painting in a museum. You're not supposed to touch it. Here, you're encouraged to do it. The icons are painted on wood, and usually the tempera is used, and then beeswax finishing is used. If you kiss and touch an icon, you don't have a feeling that you're touching an inanimate object. So this adds to the overall, as if you're touching somebody's face when you kiss the hand or the face of the Virgin. So it's a very fulfilling experience. Now, the composition of the Annunciation could appear also on gold background mosaics and in frescoes, and cover large portions of the interior walls of churches. And here is one example. This is the, and now I hope you can see, here's the spindle, this is the cord that the Virgin has spun, this is the purple wool, and this is the Archangel who has arrived from heaven to deliver the good news. The composition is very much like the two that we've just examined, but I want to turn your attention to the location of it. This is the interior of an early 12th century cathedral, the first major Christian church on the territory of Russia. And the composition of the Annunciation is positioned at two distinct parts on two different sides of the eastern section of the church. Here is the Holy Virgin, and here is the Archangel. What is important is that between the two of them, there is a very large empty space. And this is the empty space of the semicircular apse that accommodates the altar of the cathedral. So basically, the depiction of this deconstructed composition of the Annunciation marks the threshold of the holiest of all holy spaces in this Christian church. And because the Virgin is spinning the purple wool that the audiences knew was the purple wool of the curtain of the Holy of Holies of the great Temple of Jerusalem, this message, this statement was very obvious. The scene was deconstructed to enhance the notion of the sacredness of the space that is behind this line, the threshold of the holiest of all holy spaces in this church. And this is the altar. And in order to emphasize further the connection with the ritual that takes place in this space, down below in the altar apse, we have a depiction of the heavenly liturgy celebrated by nobody else but Christ himself. That's why he's depicted twice. He has just consecrated bread and wine, and in this segment of a composition, in this detail of an elaborate composition, he is delivering the he's delivering the communion with wine to one group of his apostles, and on the other side, Christ is delivering the communion with bread, and this is where the scene is located. Below the figure of the Virgin, and between the two parts of the deconstructed composition of the Annunciation, because the miracle of the Annunciation is symbolically repeated and reenacted in the bloodless sacrifice of the liturgy. Every time, according to Christian beliefs of the historical church, every time the congregations gather and prepare the holy gifts of bread and wine and pray at them, the Holy Ghost descends from heaven and transforms them, as you know, through the transubstantiation. into the body and blood of Christ. So that's what the composition is supposed to convey in this particular context. Are we running out of time? Okay. So I want to give me a sign. Okay. So I wanted to draw your attention to a general way of appreciating the significance of the Feast of the Annunciation in the older tradition. I have to say that by the high standards of the historical church, almost all of us sing tonight because there was meat in the soup, and the most the traditional church allows, because it's a big feast. So remember, this is the period of the Lent. It started a while ago. It's 40 days of fasting. And on special occasions, like the day of the Annunciation of the Virgin, there is a special dispensation. You can put olive oil in your food. Otherwise, you can't have even this. So the feast is so joyful and so important and so relevant because it happens during a very dark period, the period when we fast and we prepare ourselves to celebrate the events of the week of Passion and Christ's crucifixion and the subsequent resurrection. So these, in order to evoke associations with these events, I wanted you to look at what I believe is one of the most beautiful compositions of the crucifixion in early medieval Europe. This is an 11th century Byzantine mosaic composition of the crucifixion, depicted, rendered on the walls of a monastery located not far away from the capital of Greece, in the vicinity of the city of Athens. This is the monastery of Daphne, where, among many other gold background composition, this particular depiction of the crucifixion is rendered very concise, very understated, but very evocative. Christ's body is so perfectly rendered in a way that shows how medieval art preserves the connections with the late antique, with the late classical and the late antique tradition. This is a slightly altered rendition of a male nude marble statue that, instead of appearing in contrapposto, as he would be as an athlete or an emperor of some sort, he is attached to the cross. But even the rendition of the body of Christ is done in a manner that evokes association with carved marble. And so he's there, very graceful, very alarmingly unaware of the atrocities that have just happened. And even though he appears to be already dead, mourned by the Holy Virgin and Saint John the Divine, miraculously a jet emanates from the wound on the side of his chest. Remember, he was pierced on the side of his chest by the lance of one of the Roman soldiers. But there is red and white in this jet of blood coming out of his wound, in a reference to the fact that it's the Passion and the crucifixion that started the practice of liturgical celebration. That's, he's dead, but he's alive. Blood would not be gushing out of a dead body. So it is this seeming contradiction that is stated in the composition that is supposed to make the audiences aware of the significance of this sad event, the death of Christ on the cross. The Virgin and Saint John the Baptist are very composed. They're not tearing their hair, and they're not falling down on the ground, stricken by grief, because this scene is not supposed to be a simple illustration of the tragic event on Good Friday. This scene is a contemplation of the historic significance of the crucifixion as an integral, essential, central part of the divine economy for the salvation of mankind. Both the Holy Virgin and Saint John the Divine are graceful. Their gestures are understated and refined. Scholars have proved with certainty that these gestures have something to do with the behavior of courtiers in the imperial court of Constantinople. That's how you do it when you're presented to a member of the imperial family. And all this is a part of the visual language, but I wanted you to see it because it is the mindset that is embodied here that would allow us to appreciate the significance of the festive celebration of the Annunciation in the context of the sadness of the Lent and the pending tragedy of the Passion. There is the light around Mary, yes. Well, this is probably the spotlight of the photographer, but what it shows you is how gold background mosaics work. Every single cube of the gold background mosaic is placed at a different angle by comparison to the angle of the neighboring cube. And this is so in order to allow for the light to be reflected in different ways. So whenever there is a source of light, the gold background mosaic creates the sense that the light emanates from the mosaic itself. And light emanates from supernatural, divine, eternal entities. So it's quite appropriate to see that the light is emanating from the Holy Virgin, but you can see that there is a glow around the figure of Saint John, the divine, and of course the blood is dripping from the pierced feet of Christ onto the skull of Adam. And this is, of course, this is supposed to be a very concise visual representation of the washing away of the original sin of Adam, which became possible at the moment of the crucifixion. And as we know, the original sin of Adam was redeemed by Christ's blood on the cross. According to the tradition, the crucifixion was erected on top of the tomb of Adam so that we can have this special arrangement with the blood of Christ dripping on Adam's skull. Not all depictions of the crucifixion were so restrained and so aristocratically refined. In in monastic communities, especially in the late period of Byzantine history, there was a flavor for drama, over-the-top drama. And here is one spectacular icon, very large in size, that shows the descent from the cross. Look at the exaggerated proportions of the body of Christ. If he was, he would be somewhere 15 feet or so. And so please note the exaggerated pose. It's supposed to be a pose that embodies, that envisions the suffering through which he went. And of course, very somber tones. And here, the mourning Virgin, and here's the mourning. This is the Virgin. These are the holy women who came to the tomb of Christ with her a couple of days later. But you can see the darkness of this cosmic tragedy. This is not the refined, restrained philosophical approach to the tragedy of the crucifixion. This is gut-wrenching drama. And to make things even more explicit, the painter used a very subtle, very understated device. Look at the abundant use of highlights that allowed the painter to create a slight illusion of three-dimensionality. White was used abundantly, that you don't see white in the eyes of any of the human figures. And that's not by chance, because the light is gone from the world. And that is one very concise and very poignant way of making a statement that the event we are witnessing in this icon is a cosmic tragedy. So, and whether you prefer the more restrained and refined rendition of the tragic events of the crucifixion or the more drama-filled 14th century take on it, either way, the Feast of the Annunciation will be the brightest spot, the brightest day between the beginning of the Lent and the resurrection. So why don't we stop here and allow for questions, comments, and concerns to be voiced. Thank you so much for listening. I can pass the mic if you to ask a question.
I'm surprised that
Please.
this painting was in Russia, of all places, because of the communists and the fact that they didn't want religion. I'm surprised it still exists.
Yes. That's a very good question. The question was about how come this icon, the first one I showed you, survived in Russia. You're absolutely right. The Bolshevik Revolution desecrated Christian churches, robbed the treasuries of the Christian churches, sold them by the pound, melted precious liturgical objects, stripped gold and silver covers of icons, burned icons deliberately, publicly. But there was so much, first of all. And second, the oldest icons, already before the Bolshevik Revolution, became a part of the national artistic canon. So they survived, not even though they were Christian in subject, but they survived because they embodied the oldest period in the history of Russian art. In fact, before everything went crazy like it is now, before Stalin came to power, Lenin's minister of culture was the first one to order proper modern restoration of the most sacred icons of the Russians, miraculous icons. Icons that were never touched. They were covered in gold and diamonds and rubies and enamels, and nobody ever touched them. And you couldn't see anything except for the gold and the diamonds because the faces would be so covered with soot and with darkened varnish that there was nothing to be seen. And then they were restored for the first time, and after the fall of communism, they released the documents. So this was a very politically savvy move because it's a way of deconsecrating an icon and making it a work of art. And while doing this, of course, this was a way of inserting a devotional piece into a secular nationalist canon of art history. Thank you for your question. Anything else? Well, then, if you would like to look at some of the details that you might not have seen well, please come to the front and we can go over the images again. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Great job. Bright minds, right?
Oh, yes.
And now we have under our belt an art history class, right? And you may take classes at the University of Georgia. If you are over 65, they are free. So you could go and take his class in art for free. It's just a guess. Would you say something about Father Salzman, yes. Father Anthony? He is very, they work together on these icons. Yes. Coming next Thursday night.
It's a privilege for me to be able to introduce Father Anthony Salzman to you. I have to tell you that when I came after finishing my graduate work at Princeton, I was supposed to go to Athens, Greece for a year and a half with an Onassis fellowship, but I got this job and I got here, and all my mail went from Princeton and Washington DC to Athens, Greece. And I received it 8 months later. But the biggest surprise was that I came to Athens, Georgia, and the second day of my stay here in 1999, I was told you have to go to Watkinsville, which I didn't know what it was, in order to meet a Byzantine iconographer. And I only said, well, get out of here. How can there be a Byzantine iconographer in the state of Georgia, let alone in Watkinsville? And there was Father Anthony, who had already